Ted Bundy. On January 24, 1989, 42-year-old Ted Bundy was strapped into the electric chair at Florida State Prison. Bundy had spent over a decade on death row after being convicted of multiple murders. He'd confessed to killing 30 women across 7 states during the 1970s, though investigators believed the actual number was higher. By 1989, Bundy had exhausted his appeals. He'd spent his final days giving interviews, confessing to additional murders, and attempting to delay his execution. On the morning of January 24th, he ate his last meal and met with his attorney and a religious advisor. Around 7 a.m., guards escorted Bundy from his cell to the execution chamber. He was seated in Old Sparky, Florida's electric chair. Electrodes were attached to his head and right leg. A black leather mask was placed over his face. At 7:06 a.m., the executioner activated the chair. 2,000 volts surged through Bundy's body. The initial jolt lasted 1 minute, followed by a lower voltage. Smoke rose from the electrode on his leg. At 7:16 a.m., Ted Bundy was pronounced dead. Outside the prison, an extraordinary scene had developed. Instead of a solemn gathering, thousands of people had assembled in what resembled a tailgate party. They wore "Burn Bundy Burn" t-shirts and held signs celebrating his execution. Vendors sold merchandise. People brought beer, coolers, and lawn chairs. Some set off fireworks. When the white hearse carrying Bundy's body exited the prison gates, the crowd erupted in cheers. They screamed and celebrated as if their favorite sports team had won a championship. The execution of Ted Bundy attracted more public celebration than any execution in modern American history. The charismatic law student who'd murdered dozens of young women had become the most hated man in America. Jeffrey Dahmer. On November 28, 1994, 34-year-old Jeffrey Dahmer was assigned to clean a prison bathroom with 2 other inmates at the Columbia Correctional Institution in Wisconsin. Dahmer had been sentenced to 15 consecutive life terms for murdering and dismembering 17 young men and boys. His crimes included cannibalism and keeping body parts as trophies. Dahmer's fellow inmates despised him. Despite being in protective custody for much of his sentence, he'd recently been integrated into the general population. On the morning of November 28th, a work detail included Dahmer, Jesse Anderson, and Christopher Scarver. Scarver was a convicted murderer serving a life sentence. He'd told other inmates he believed God had sent him messages and that he was an instrument of divine justice. Scarver had been collecting newspaper clippings about Dahmer's crimes. The 3 men were left unsupervised in the prison gym bathroom. Scarver confronted Dahmer, pulling out the newspaper clippings. He asked Dahmer if the reported crimes were true. Dahmer didn't deny them. Scarver attacked, using a 20-inch metal bar from the weight room equipment. He struck Dahmer repeatedly in the head and face. Dahmer fell to the floor. Scarver continued the assault until Dahmer stopped moving. Scarver also attacked Jesse Anderson, who died from his injuries. Guards found both victims approximately 20 minutes later. Dahmer was rushed to the hospital, but was pronounced dead within an hour. Christopher Scarver later said Dahmer hadn't screamed or tried to fight back. He described Dahmer as seemingly accepting his fate. Scarver was convicted of 2 counts of first-degree murder and received 2 additional life sentences. Jeffrey Dahmer's death came less than 3 years into his sentence. The man who'd committed unspeakable acts died violently in a prison bathroom at the hands of another inmate who believed he was carrying out God's will. John Wayne Gacy. On May 10, 1994, 52-year-old John Wayne Gacy was executed by lethal injection at Stateville Correctional Center in Illinois. Gacy had been convicted of murdering 33 young men and boys between 1972 and 19... He'd buried most of his victims in the crawl space beneath his suburban Chicago home. Gacy had spent 14 years on death row, during which he'd painted hundreds of artworks that he sold to collectors. He maintained his innocence despite overwhelming evidence. In his final years, he gave multiple interviews claiming he was framed. On the day of his execution, Gacy ate a final meal of fried chicken, French fries, strawberries, and Diet Coke. He met with family members and his attorneys for final visits. Around midnight, he was transferred to the death chamber. At 12:58 a.m., Gacy was strapped to a gurney. IVs were inserted into both arms. The warden read the death warrant and asked if Gacy had any last words. Gacy looked at the witnesses and corrections officers. His final words were brief and defiant. "Kiss my ass." The lethal injection process began. However, there was a complication. The chemicals solidified in the IV tube, clogging the line. The execution was paused for 15 minutes while technicians fixed the problem and replaced the IV. When the injection resumed, the chemicals flowed properly. Gacy lost consciousness within seconds. His breathing became shallow, then stopped. At 12:58 a.m., John Wayne Gacy was pronounced dead, 18 minutes after the process began. Outside the prison, crowds had gathered similar to Bundy's execution. People cheered when officials announced Gacy was dead. The man who dressed as Pogo the Clown to entertain children, while secretly murdering young men, died with a sneer on his face, offering no remorse or apology. Aileen Wuornos. On October 9, 2002, 46-year-old Aileen Wuornos was executed by lethal injection at Florida State Prison. Wuornos had been convicted of murdering 7 men in Florida between 1989. She claimed the killings were in self-defense against men who'd assaulted or attempted to assault her while she worked as a prostitute. Wuornos had become one of America's most notorious female serial killers. Her life story, marked by extreme poverty, abuse, and violence, had been the subject of books and films. During her years on death row, her mental state deteriorated significantly. By 2002, Wuornos had exhausted her appeals. She'd begun demanding her own execution, firing her attorneys and refusing further legal challenges. She claimed prison staff were torturing her with sonic weapons and poisoning her food. Her paranoid delusions intensified. On the morning of October 9th, Aileen Wuornos was prepared for execution. She was escorted to the death chamber and strapped to the gurney. The warden asked if she had any final words. Wuornos delivered a bizarre, rambling statement that referenced movies and conspiracy theories. Her final words were, "I'd just like to say I'm sailing with the Rock, and I'll be back like Independence Day, with Jesus June 6, like the movie, big mothership and all. I'll be back." The reference to the alien invasion movie Independence Day and her claim she'd return with Jesus demonstrated her deteriorating mental condition. Some observers questioned whether she'd been competent to waive her appeals. The lethal injection was administered. Aileen Wuornos lost consciousness and died within minutes. Her body was cremated, and her ashes were scattered beneath a tree in Michigan by her childhood friend, Dean Corll. On August 8, 1973, 33-year-old Dean Corll was shot and killed in his home in Pasadena, Texas. Corll hadn't been arrested or tried. He was killed by his own teenage accomplice during what would have been another murder. For 3 years, Corll had been abducting, torturing, and murdering teenage boys in the Houston area. He'd enlisted 2 teenagers, David Brooks and Elmer Wayne Henley, to help lure victims. The boys brought friends and acquaintances to Corll's home, where they were killed. Corll paid the teenagers for each victim. On the night of August 7, 1973, Henley brought 2 friends to Corll's house, a 15-year-old boy and a 15-year-old girl. The 3 teenagers fell asleep at the house after drinking and sniffing paint fumes. When they woke, they found themselves handcuffed. Corll was furious that Henley had brought a girl. Corll only targeted boys. He threatened to kill all 3 teenagers, including Henley. Corll began preparing his torture equipment and talking about what he'd do to them. Henley realized he was about to become a victim. He talked Corll into releasing him, promising he'd help torture and kill the other 2. Corll removed Henley's handcuffs. Once free, Henley grabbed Corll's .22 caliber pistol. He pointed it at Corll and ordered him to stop. Corll lunged at Henley. Henley fired 6 times, hitting Corll multiple times in the shoulder and back. Dean Corll staggered toward his telephone, trying to call for help. He collapsed while attempting to crawl through his glass sliding door. He died on the floor of his home. Henley called police and confessed everything. He led investigators to burial sites where Corll had buried victims. Eventually, 28 bodies were recovered from 3 locations. At the time, it was the worst case of serial murder in American history. Dean Corll, known as the Candyman because his family had owned a candy factory, was killed by the teenager he'd manipulated into helping him murder. The student had turned on the master, Harold Shipman. On January 13, 2004, 57-year-old Harold Shipman was found hanging in his cell at Wakefield Prison in West Yorkshire, England. Shipman had been a family doctor who'd murdered at least 215 patients over decades, though investigators suspected the true number exceeded 250. He was Britain's most prolific serial killer. Shipman had been convicted in 2000 of murdering 15 patients by injecting them with lethal doses of diamorphine. He'd killed elderly patients, then forged records to make the deaths appear natural. He was caught when he'd forged a will leaving a patient's estate to himself. Shipman maintained his innocence throughout his trial and imprisonment. He refused to cooperate with investigators trying to identify all his victims. He was sentenced to 15 consecutive life terms with no possibility of parole. On January 12, 2004, Shipman was on suicide watch, but guards had determined he wasn't an immediate risk. That evening, he was in his cell alone. Using bedsheets, he fashioned a noose and attached it to the bars of his cell window. On the morning of January 13th, guards found Shipman hanging. He was pronounced dead. The date was significant for a calculated reason. Investigations revealed Shipman had timed his suicide deliberately. His 58th birthday was the next day, January 14th. Under British National Health Service pension rules, if Shipman died before age 58, his wife would receive a full lump sum pension payment of approximately £100,000 plus a lifetime weekly allowance. By killing himself on January 13th, Shipman ensured his wife would receive the maximum possible pension benefits. Had he died after his 58th birthday, the payout would have been significantly reduced. His final act was a calculated financial decision to benefit his family. Harold Shipman's suicide denied justice to the families of his many victims. He took the full extent of his crimes to his grave, never revealing the complete truth about how many people he'd murdered. Richard Ramirez. On June 7, 2013, 53-year-old Richard Ramirez died at Marin General Hospital in California. Ramirez, known as the Night Stalker, had terrorized Southern California in 1985, committing at least 13 murders, numerous sexual assaults, and burglaries. His random selection of victims and brutal violence had created widespread panic. Ramirez had been sentenced to death in 1989, but spent 23 years on death row at California's San Quentin State Prison. He'd become a dark celebrity, receiving fan mail and even marrying one of his admirers in prison. His defiant attitude and satanic imagery had created a cult following. By 2013, Ramirez's health had deteriorated significantly. Years of hepatitis C had destroyed his liver function. The disease had progressed to cirrhosis and then liver failure. He'd also developed B-cell lymphoma, a cancer of the immune system. In his final months, Ramirez was hospitalized multiple times. The liver failure caused severe jaundice. His skin turned a sickly greenish-yellow color. Fluid accumulated in his abdomen, causing painful bloating. The man who'd once strutted in court and flashed pentagram symbols drawn on his palm had become a shadow. On June 7, 2013, Richard Ramirez died at the hospital from complications of B-cell lymphoma and liver disease. He'd never been executed. California's death penalty appeals process had kept him alive for over 2 decades. The Night Stalker who'd terrorized millions and maintained a cocky, unrepentant attitude died bloated and discolored in a hospital bed. His death came not from execution, but from disease. The final photographs of Ramirez showed him unrecognizable from his younger self. His skin turned green from organ failure. Corll Panzram. On September 5, 1930, 38-year-old Corll Panzram was executed by hanging at United States Penitentiary, Leavenworth, Kansas. Panzram had confessed to murdering 21 people and committing thousands of other crimes across multiple countries. He'd spent most of his adult life in prisons. Panzram had been sentenced to death for murdering a civilian foreman at Leavenworth. Unlike most condemned prisoners, he showed no fear or remorse. He actively wanted to be executed and mocked efforts to save him. In his final weeks, Panzram wrote an autobiography that detailed his crimes and his hatred for humanity. He wrote, "In my lifetime, I have murdered 21 human beings. I have committed thousands of burglaries, robberies, larcenies, arsons, and, last but not least, I have committed sodomy on more than 1,000 male human beings. For all these things, I am not in the least bit sorry." On the morning of September 5th, guards came to take Panzram to the gallows. He walked calmly, as the executioner placed the noose around his neck and made adjustments. Panzram grew impatient. The executioner was taking time to ensure the rope was positioned correctly and the mechanism would function properly. Panzram, showing no fear, spat and shouted his final words. "Hurry it up, you Hoosier bastard. I could hang a dozen men while you're fooling around." Moments later, the trap door opened. Corll Panzram dropped and died by hanging. He'd gone to his death not just unrepentant, but actively rushing his executioners. His autobiography later became an important document for criminal psychologists studying sociopathy. Peter Sutcliffe. On November 13, 2020, 74-year-old Peter Sutcliffe died at University Hospital of North Durham in England. Sutcliffe, known as the Yorkshire Ripper, had murdered at least 13 women and attempted to murder 7 others between 1975 and 1980 in Yorkshire and Manchester. Sutcliffe had been sentenced to 20 concurrent life terms in 1981. He'd initially been sent to a maximum security psychiatric hospital, claiming he'd murdered prostitutes because God had commanded him to cleanse the streets. In 2016, he was transferred to Franklin Prison in County Durham. In October 2020, during the COVID-19 pandemic, Sutcliffe contracted the coronavirus. The virus spread rapidly through the prison. Sutcliffe's age and underlying health conditions made him particularly vulnerable. He developed severe respiratory symptoms. Medical staff offered treatment including ventilation and intensive care. However, Sutcliffe refused all medical intervention. He told prison staff and doctors that it was God's will that he die. He'd spent decades claiming divine instructions for his murders, and now he claimed divine instructions for his death. Sutcliffe's condition deteriorated rapidly. His lungs filled with fluid. He struggled to breathe as the virus progressed. On November 13th, Peter Sutcliffe died, essentially drowning in his own lungs as the virus destroyed his respiratory system. His refusal of treatment appeared to be partially motivated by religious delusion and partially by acceptance that his life was over. Some observers suggested he wanted to die rather than continue serving his sentence. The Yorkshire Ripper died from COVID-19 complications, a disease that had killed millions worldwide. If you enjoyed this video, subscribe for similar ones, and feel free to drop suggestions for the next video in the comments.